Every communist knows just how split the socialist movement is. This is because often dogma and cults of personality prevent people from using their critical thinking abilities. It's in stark contrast to how Marx and Engels imagined socialism as a revolutionary science. Revolutionary science is a mighty weapon, a sword in the hands of the oppressed. But it becomes blunt if it's not wielded by a sharp mind. Revolutionary science is held against the same standards as other sciences. Most importantly, the answer to a question should not be formulated before doing the research, mistakes should be admitted and corrected, and wrong opinions should be cast aside once new information arises. One of the great splits that has affected the communist movement for decades is the question of whether the Soviet Union after Stalin has restored some kind of capitalism. This, along with the consequent question of whether the Soviet Union was a social imperialist superpower, is nowadays just as heatedly debated as in the 1960s. The LLCO used to stand in the Maoist tradition, criticizing the post-Stalin Soviet Union as a capitalist imperialist exploiter. However, after analyzing the available evidence, we have now revised our stance on Soviet revisionism. This video series will analyze various aspects of the Soviet economy, political system, foreign relations, and general history. This first part deals with the Soviet economy. If you are interested in reading our complete analysis in detail, head to our website, LLCO.org. If Khrushchev restored capitalism, it was obviously not traditional, liberal capitalism. But restorationists would argue anyway that the Soviet Union after Stalin had become state capitalist. This means that the new bourgeoisie collectively owned the means of production and made investment decisions based on profitability. They extracted surplus value from the workers for themselves and for the sake of reinvestment, causing workers to suffer increasing exploitation. How valid are these claims? It's true. Profitability was introduced as a measure of economic performance, but it didn't work the same way it works under capitalism. Why is that? 1. Profit was not consistent. Depending on the industry and on the socialist country, there were different ways of calculating it. Profit was also not objective because the state fixed prices often below or above value. 2. Profit wasn't the only measure of enterprise performance. There were other tasks and measures that sometimes even contradicted profit. 3. Major economic decisions were planned centrally with little attention given to profitability. And lastly, loss-incurring enterprises were a common aspect of economic planning and were even subsidized. The researcher Joseph Wilshinsky concluded that profit hadn't been accepted as an end, but merely a means. What about the distribution of wealth and income after Stalin? Wages in the Soviet Union were actually converging. Also, the distribution of pre-tax income was slightly more egalitarian under Khrushchev and Brezhnev than under Stalin. On the other hand, the revisionist system of material incentives benefited managers more than workers. But this didn't result in a corresponding increase in income inequality. Therefore, there must have been additional factors at play. One was that the money from enterprises' incentive funds that was used to pay out bonuses was only partly distributed on an individual basis. 1/3 was either distributed on a collective basis or among people with special needs. The exact details were decided on by either workers' councils, factory committees, or by special meetings of all workers. It's unclear if this fact alone could mitigate the pro-management bias of the bonus system, but there were additional mechanisms at play that mitigated the effects of income inequality. For example, the state set prices often below or above the actual value of the product. Especially luxury goods were artificially expensive, while food and other daily needs were artificially cheap. It seems that despite introducing material incentives, there was no significant accumulation of wealth in the hands of a new capitalist class. But were Soviet workers not increasingly exploited after Stalin? Firstly, exploitation doesn't mean that workers don't receive the full value of what they produce as wages. That's not even the case in socialism, since on an enterprise level, there needs to be constant capital to finance machines and resources. On a societal level, part of the surplus value needs to be collected to provide services like healthcare and public infrastructure. Thus, we can't speak of exploitation in the Soviet Union because we don't have a parasitic capitalist class. Everything that is being produced does directly or indirectly benefit workers. Of course, there were still unwanted phenomena. In certain cases after the reforms, work intensity increased faster than workers' wages. But this alone doesn't proof capitalist restoration. It can also occur when the share of private consumption decreases in relation to collective consumption in the same time that work intensity increases. Depending on the context, a situation like this might even respond to certain economic necessities of the time and industry. It might also be simply right opportunism that tries to facilitate more investment at the cost of workers' wages. In any way, without demonstrating that the wage difference is systematically appropriated by a new capitalist class, this example fails to proof the restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union. Similar goes for forced overtime. At the end of production cycles, directors often forced their workers to work overtime in order to make up for shortcomings that happened earlier during the month. But this is hardly proof of capitalist restoration because it happened under Stalin, too. Forced overtime was also illegal and publicly criticized, and workers might even have willingly accepted to work overtime because plan fulfillment often entitled them to bonuses. But what about the black market? The second economy grew after Stalin. It worked according to capitalist logic and provided consumer goods based on market incentives. This would take on several forms. Some people would steal goods from their workplace and sell them illegally. Others would not steal products but machinery and start producing themselves. And still others would open underground factories and even hire workers. These underground factories often involved the management of state enterprises and operated under the same roof. But they couldn't go unnoticed without bribing state officials. Is the occurrence of a black market enough to prove that Khrushchev restored capitalism in the Soviet Union? Not really. There is no reason to believe that the black market was an intentional feature of the post-Stalin Soviet economy, whether it was socialist or capitalist. The black market didn't complement the legal economy. It hindered the state plan from being executed effectively because materials stolen from the workplace reduced the output of state enterprises. Those would then report distorted numbers back to the central planners and thus paint a wrong picture of input and output requirements. Private economic activity also increased income inequality, which resulted in public resentment. This could hardly be in the interest of any political elite, be it capitalist or socialist. Therefore, capitalist activity was punished by death. Workers and peasants were as much involved in the black market as managers, and sometimes made considerable money for themselves. But most small offenses were tolerated by the state to lift the pressure of consumer goods production from it. Actual capitalist activities were apparently the main focus of state repression. The failure of Khrushchev and Brezhnev to fight the black market should be criticized as right opportunism. But since the party and state bureaucracy as a whole did not profit from the illegal economy, it's hardly evidence for capitalist restoration. All restorationist arguments assume that there was a new capitalist class in the Soviet Union. Is this assumption viable? In traditional Marxist-Leninist theory, class is decided by one's relation to the means of production. If one owns means of production, he/she is a capitalist. If one doesn't, he/she is proletarian. Restorationists claim that the bureaucracy was a class because it collectively owned the means of production. However, the line between bureaucracy and non-bureaucracy was blurry. Who was this new capitalist class? Was it all party members? Was it all state officials? If not, which position did you have to reach to be part of the capitalist class? As the LLCO evaluates science by its usefulness, we reject the idea that there was a new capitalist class in the USSR. Since it's impossible to precisely determine who was part of this class, this theory can't provide any additional insight into the nature of Soviet society. We fully agree that there were contradictions between a bourgeois bureaucratic mindset and a socialist proletarian mindset. but we find it misleading to define them as contradicting class interests. A bourgeois mindset wasn't limited to the bureaucracy. Likewise, a proletarian mindset was not limited to working-class people. Even within the alleged ruling class, there were still principled communists. Our conclusion so far is that the Soviet economy had not been restored to any kind of capitalism, but it did suffer from right opportunism. The politics of Khrushchev and Brezhnev no longer inspired the people in the name of communism, but appealed to their material short-term desires. This right opportunism made them introduce the bonus system and tolerate the black market, despite its disintegrating effects on society. The next part of this series will deal with the Soviet Union's political system and the influence of workers on politics.